Welcome to this webinar, Exploring Financing Systems for Sustainable Impact. In this section, we are going to refer to some fundamentals, some backgrounds, detail that let us understand much better the systems for financing sustainable development. But before moving to that aspect, I believe it's important to check that we are talking about the same thing. So, what do we mean by sustainable development? And the question is important because while there is a common understanding in the field that sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. The way in which the expression sustainable development has been used tends to be sometimes very flexible, and it is not uncommon that we have actually conversations assuming that sustainable development means exactly the same, and there might be some discussion about it. Of course, some of you may be aware that relatively recently there are discussions about whether or not sustainable development is becoming obsolete, and for example, instead of sustainable development, we should move to talk about regeneration, for example. So, in that context, my point is that the concept of sustainable development is not necessarily a trouble-free concept. And we, in this talk, will be referring to sustainable development in the sense of the traditional definition that we mentioned. Also important to clarify is that for a long time by sustainable development used to be understood environmentally in terms of the environment, and more recently has become more common to include in the idea of sustainability, sustainable development, the aspects of social development, economic development, and environmental development. So in this talk, when I make reference to sustainability, to sustainable development, I am including all these three aspects of the concept rather than just environmental aspects. Having said that, it's also important to refer to the idea that for some, sustainability is not enough, and we need regenerative cultures, as we mentioned before. In terms of clarification, my view is for this talk that the idea of regeneration and regenerative cultures is something that can be included in the broader understanding of sustainability and sustainable development. Now we are moving to the SDGs. We are going to talk in general in connection to the financing of sustainable development goals. There is this image that now we are getting used, we are familiarized with the 17 SDGs. And something interesting for the purpose of this conversation is that when we talk about the financial aspects, the financial sector, it's not immediately clear where that belongs or where does it fit in relation to these 16 or 17 goals, including the last one that refers to the partnerships. The aspect of the financial system, the financial sector, has been in relation to the goal number 8 regarding the economic aspects. However, even if you take a look at the information in the Sustainable Development Goal 8, you will realize that the elements related to the financial system, the financial sector, have been increasingly referred as part or as a ramification of what United Nations started as a project, to an initiative to decide, to understand, to discuss in public deliberation what is the financial system that we need in relation to the idea of sustainable development. So it is in relation to that ramification of the SDG 8, and in particular this question that United Nations put forward about what exactly is the idea, the concept, how the financial system should work in order to help us to achieve the not only goal number 8, but all the goals that are in connection to sustainable development. It is something that has been more recently developed with a follow-up report that is showing how to align some ideas about the need for alignment, and in which way the financial system could align to be much more effective for the purpose of making possible the sustainable development goals. With that background, I would like to mention that there are a series of frequently asked questions about what is social finance, what is social impact, what is the difference between the mainstream financial mechanism, the financial sector, the financial industry. And in relation to this, I would like also to make a clarification. Sometimes it's common to find the use of financial system as a synonym of financial industry or financial sector. And in the case of this talk, we are going to make the distinction of financial sector as a group of organizations and as an activity that is very specific on financial means to make easier the undertaking of different projects, as opposed to the financial system, or probably financial systems in plural, that have this systemic approach where the different elements of the financial system contribute with a very specific function to achieve its essential purposes. In terms of the frequently asked questions, one important has been in which sense there is the emergency of an alternative, a parallel sector to provide financial services very specific for sustainable development, for example? Or are we talking about something that is part of the same mainstream financial system, and it's just the financial system mainstream that is gradually converging with the Sustainable Development Goals, for example? The way this has evolved in practice, I believe, allows to see that the number of views about this topic, the number of different agendas and the very different context, the contextual circumstances in different societies, even within one country, makes very difficult to draw a clear line between what is mainstream finance, what is something that is mainstream but is adapting to the new context worldwide, and what is sustainable or social finance that can be distinguished as a separate entity or concept in relation to financial mainstream organizations. So in the way we are going to explore the topic, it won't matter much what is the reason for an organization to join the effort to provide financial solutions in order to achieve goals, very specific objectives that can be applied within the framework of the SDGs, or that can have a very different framework, not necessarily the SDGs, but that is contributing to what, in a broader sense, can be understood as sustainable development. So, having said that, there is indeed the growing of organizations that come from different stakeholders that are looking at different needs, not necessarily the traditional one of producing profit, for example. And it is in that different perspective, different approach about what we expect from the financial sector, from the financial system, that we are going to encounter some aspects that are a matter of distinction between mainstream finance and what we could call now social finance or sustainable finance. I prefer the word or the expression sustainable finance as opposed to social finance, because I believe sustainable finance is again a broader concept, and that way we don't need to make the clarification that by social finance we also mean things that are not social but are like economic or environmental aspects. So for that reason, I would use or I would prefer make the reference to sustainable finance as opposed to social finance. However, in general, it's been used as a synonym. In the frequently asked questions, I'm going to provide you with a link to a website where I believe you could find very interesting, relevant explanations about the most common questions about what is social finance, what is the social impact, how does this work, who are the actors, who are the main players, why someone would need to resort to new organizations that are providing financial services, or why these financial services needs to be adjusted or done in a different way or with different features as opposed to mainstream finance. So I believe taking a look at that website will be particularly interesting to explore and to contrast also whether or not your current understanding of the different points corresponds to what you will find in that website. moving on, there are two main types of social impact or sustainable impact investment. At least that's one way in which we could organize the different types of impact investment. One is borrowing. We are talking about debt. The other one can be regarded as equity, as shares, and basically instead of borrowing, we are talking about an investment, a commitment that the participant in that form, in that modality, is making, becoming partner somehow of the organization that is receiving the resources, the funding in the way of shares or equity, or modalities similar to shares or conventional equity. So basically we are having these two main distinctions. One of the distinction or one of the importance of making that distinction is that in practice it could be very different if as an investor my risk depends on a series of guarantees or collateral that I could obtain from the person or the organization receiving the funding, and my security of getting back my money plus probably the agreed interest will not depend much on whether or not there is success in the working of the person or the organization that I'm lending the money. In contrast to that, if I am investing in shares, if I am becoming partner of the organization, I am running the risk of the enterprise, and the position is different. There might be also very different views about whether or not it's relevant to have those options, whether or not a normal system of providing credit to the actors that require the funding is enough and adequate, whether or not there is a real need for having a combination of a more diverse mix of alternative ways of providing funding, financing projects. Sometimes it's been argued that at the end of the day the cost of the money will be basically the same, or that it depends much on the particular circumstances of the economy in which you are working. So in this case, the main point that I want to make here is there is that distinction, and from that distinction of equity or borrowing will develop different types of financial intermediaries, and that is something that whether or not at the end of the day the outcome numerically could be the same or slightly different does not change the fact that the way the financial intermediaries are evolving will be different depending on what type of services they are providing in this element of alternatives. In general, and here I have some data that comes from the Good Finance website. The updated information states that most debt investments are paid back with interest, a fee that you pay to the investor for the use of their money. For example, an investor loans an organization £10,000 and you repay a total of £11,000 at £229 per month over 4 years. That is an example of what you could expect as a general situation with borrowing. In the case of shares, selling shares in your organization to an investor, that's the idea, and equity investors receive a share of any profits paid out by the organization and get to have a say in how the organization is run. For example, an investor pays £10,000 to own 10% of your organization. So with those ideas, I would like to move now to show you a series of types and subtypes of social or sustainable investment. I'm using for this data from the Good Finance project. The way you can find information in that place presents in a very easy way all the alternatives that they have mapped, but you can classify them very easily by equity or shares, or by borrowing, or by other types that do not fit, strictly speaking, in the two main categories that we mentioned first. In terms of shares, we have three examples: community shares, equity investment, and social investment tax relief. These three are elements that have evolved in the context of the United Kingdom. However, with some differences can be found in another places, and has been explored as a possibility for making adaptations in different geographies other than the UK. However, in this website that I would like you to consider as one of the main to take a look at this type of information, you will find very specific details about what each of these modalities consist of, and some examples of organizations that are being funded using this type of alternatives. In terms of borrowing, is much more ample the options. For example, we have a blended that combine, for example, part of a grant and part of a loan. We have charity bonds. We have secured loans. We have social investment tax relief as well. We have unsecured, including overdrafts, borrowing. In terms of other types that do not fit with the first two categories, we have here the crowdfunding investment. In terms of crowdfunding, while it is not mentioned in the same way in that website, we can also talk about crowdfunding in terms of borrowing, and crowdfunding in terms of crowd equity, with similar difference or implications as we explained from the main two types. We have also quasi-equity. We have social impact bonds, and we have social property funds. In addition to these alternatives, there are other 6 that are suggested as something that can also be used, mechanisms that can be used for a sustainable impact. One of them is resorting to accelerators, incubators, and organizations that use the system of challenges. Another option is reward-based crowdfunding, family and friends as well, grants, conventional finance, and reserves from the funds of an organization. I would like to highlight the fact that conventional finance is presented here as an alternative to the other series of mechanisms that we have seen. I think it's an interesting topic to discuss whether or not conventional finance or mainstream finance is something that we could regard as an alternative in this context of different mechanisms that can be used to fund social enterprises. Aspect of talking about conventional finance or mainstream finance does not necessarily change the nature of the mechanisms that these organizations may use to fund a project. So for that reason, I tend to disagree in including or talking about conventional finance as an alternative to the mechanism that we have explored so far. There are different ways of classifying the mechanism. There are different ways of understanding the roles and the benefits, the cons and pros of these alternatives. At the end of the day, what we can be sure is that there is no universal recipe in this field. No one can claim to have the monopoly of the truth, as it has been said elsewhere. Something that I believe is very exciting about this field is that it's providing us with a lot of room for creativity and for innovation in terms of how the mechanisms adapt to the real needs, how the different actors involved create their own dynamics, and that has an implication, especially in terms of social impact and, as opposed to mainstream finance. However, the interesting aspect to me here is that the opportunity for developing the financial system or adjusting, enriching, or supplementing the financial system depends very much on creativity of the users, and that leads to another important element. To whom should be address the financial sector, the financial system? Who should be the users or the direct beneficiaries of those services? In this section, we are talking now about sustainable impact enterprises. Some people prefer the term of social businesses. Basically, we are talking about organizations that, unlike conventional commercial organizations, these sustainable impact enterprises not only have a business plan, but they have an impact plan. Because the idea is that these organizations will generate the profit. It will be a profitable enterprise, but at the same level of importance, essentially, they will be committed, their their core purpose of their incorporation is generating an activity that changes somehow their context, the circumstances in which they operate. They need to make a transformation to the real world. And that transformation will be precisely what we call the social or the sustainable impact. That impact needs to be something that is meant to happen. It's good if an organization produces something that, in addition or by chance, generates a positive impact. However, the idea of this, or one characteristic of these social impact enterprises, is that they need to make the special effort to, in advance, be very clear about what specific actions they are going to undertake that predictably will generate the change or the improvements in terms of social or environmental or economic, or a combination of this impact. So in order to be able to do that, they will need to go through the process of having a proper theory of change that states from the very beginning exactly what is that they are going to do and why, very specifically, they associate certain outcomes that together or individually will be or can be attributed to those actions the benefit in terms of sustainable impact. So that's an implication that makes a big difference for social impact enterprises as opposed to the conventional commercial enterprise. The element that will attract investors to help or to facilitate the growing and the well-functioning with resources to a social enterprise from the side of investors will be not necessarily the social impact on its own, but the commitment of the enterprise to generating both types of the combination that is offered in advance. I would like to present you now with 4 examples of this type of organizations. One of them has been funded by the Charity Bank in the UK. I will explain later more details about that particular type of financial intermediary. But for the purpose of the aspect of this social enterprise, what is important is to know that Charity Bank only lends money to organizations whose sole purpose is generating a social or environmental economic impact. In this case, this organization, Settle Hydro, has a very interesting story that goes around a river in a community, the local community, and they find the possibility of acquiring an engine to generate some electricity with the river power, and they find the way of producing an income selling that energy. They will provide energy to the local community, and they realize that there will be a surplus in what they are generating, and that can be sold to the national grid, and that generates a regular source of income. Of course, they don't have all the money that is required in order to implement the idea, and after looking for different alternatives of mainstream finance, they realize that they are not eligible, or they are not being able to attract the funding that they needed, and they come in touch with this charity bank. The charity bank, because that's their purpose, that's what they do, is not charity, is in the sense of philanthropy. The charity bank is a commercial bank, but it's charity because it's usually a provider of financial services for organizations that are charitable. So this bank provides the money that was required. Everything is implemented, and is implemented according to the plan, and it's successful in terms of generating the electricity that will satisfy the local community, and that starts helping them to actually repay, as agreed, the loan to the charity bank. The thing is, not only that organization generated a renewable energy solution, but also in order to implement that process involved interaction, a very different dynamic with the local community. And that level of engagement and cooperation that I'm sure was not necessarily always smooth, but that led the community to operate with a different dynamic, and that different dynamic has positives as well. So there are other benefits that come from the actual operation of the organization that made possible to establish this system of generating clean energy in a way that helped the local community. Also, it generated employment, and is one of the examples where the actual amount was not necessarily huge. This is something that you could see. We are talking about far below £1 million, and the benefits are very clear in terms of how this financial intermediary, the charity bank, made possible a project that otherwise may have not happened. In the information that I'm including as part of this talk, you will find a link to where you can learn more about the specific details of that case. There is another example that was funded by the Social Stock Exchange in Spain. This organization, the name is Farmidable, and they play very interestingly with the word of farming and something that is wonderful, formidable as well. So what does this Farmidable organization do? They are trying to solve a need in the area surrounding Madrid, where people have left, or local agriculture has declined. And one of the reasons for this to happen is that for a long time some farmers realized that they were not selling part of their products. It was not necessarily as good business as it used to be, and they have engaged throughout time in other activities for income generation, and that has created a systemic problem in terms of food needs to be bought from far away, and the prices are not exactly the same, and the qualities are not necessarily the same that could be produced locally. And there is this initiative to what would happen if we generate a commitment, we create a commitment with people to go back to the local farms, and the farmers have the problem of they are not willing to take the risk of going back to the farm and then being not in position to sell what they are producing. However, the organization Farmidable, something that is doing is to find the stakeholders that are interested in buying that local production. Those stakeholders are partly local community, but also, for example, local schools that need to provide children with some food during the day in the school. And one of the options for these schools is to acquire precisely from the local production. It will be a more attractive price for the schools and of course for local families. And the activity starts becoming a virtuous cycle in which Farmidable is also organizing the process of how to put everyone connected and how to arrange for the process of the gathering and commercialization of the products. The organization is working very well. You could see also, I'm providing you in this talk with the details, so you can check the information. This comes from the Social Stock Exchange in Spain, and you could see how good they are actually doing. And in addition to the social impact, the economic impact that they are generating, they are able to, they are in position to repay the money that was obtained through a process similar to crowdfunding. Something interesting is that the particular scheme that Farmidable managed to use with the support of the Social Stock Exchange in Madrid clearly shows, it has a demonstration effect that with relatively a small amount of money, things can change dramatically in terms of the local conditions. So of course that has a series of benefits in cascade, and the interesting thing is also how they are measuring and how they are reporting the impact that has been happening. There is another example that I want to mention that is the Chototel. This is a company that is in India. The Chototel as a company is based in the UK, but is operating in relation to India. And this organization is being funded through the system of the Social Stock Exchange in the UK. They have a very interesting solution for housing. The idea is to solve or contribute to solve an important problem of housing, affordable housing. But in this case, affordable housing doesn't mean a place where you wouldn't like to live. If you visit the website, and I'm providing also with you with these details, you will find that they are able to offer accommodation in a modern place for between $2 and $5 per month, and the type of facilities make an enormous difference in relation to the circumstances of the people who are the target of this initiative. So this Chototel has been also running in a very successful way, and is being not only solving or contributing to the SDGs in terms of housing, but also one way in which the Chototel managed to lower their costs is by implementing, using technology for the generation of electricity, for the management and the actual running of the facilities. It's a very interesting case of how it operates in a very modern, sophisticated way to solve the different tasks that are in the running of the organization and the actual facilities where people live. And it has proved that it has a viable business solution to a real need in India, and clearly the replicability again is huge. So it is one of the examples that I invite you to explore and to learn how they are operating. Another example, the final that I'm going to mention now, comes also from the UK Social Stock Exchange, but this is a company that is based in Canada. The organization, the name is FigBytes, and FigBytes has produced, among other services that they are selling, they created a software, a very sophisticated software that is precisely meant to facilitate the work of large organizations, governments, large enterprises, to account in a very efficient way for the different activities that they do on daily basis that relate to the Sustainable Development Goals. It generates a very interesting database, and the capability of the software to generate reports and to provide data in real time that is useful for decision-making processes, especially in large organizations. We are talking about large organizations, including, for example, governments, makes a big difference in terms of the need of collecting, analyzing, classifying, and reporting the data that relates to the impact that gradually is generating, and well, it's one organization that I also invite you to take a look, because also you might be particularly interested precisely in relation to the topic of this software that they are presenting, or is already being used commercially for various organizations, and I believe you will find very attractive to take a look at that organization. Precisely the type of solutions that this software creates is very helpful for financial intermediaries and for social investors, because it's also one way in which they can assess what are their options and how they are doing with the services they are providing. So that's in relation to the element, the pillar of the social enterprises. Now I'm moving to talking about the the second pillar, that is the sustainable impact investors. Something interesting in relation to this group of actors in the process of the financial means for sustainable development is that until very recently, most of the main social finance investors have been some governments, some foundations, individuals have participated in a very limited way, to the extent that it is unclear and it's very difficult to know the information about who is participating in terms of numbers as individuals. So much of the funding that comes from on the side of investors for social finance comes also from banks that have, in the case of the UK, I'm using that example, have for different reasons decided to contribute with figures like £10 million, £4 million in the case of HSBC and JP Morgan respectively. Goldman Sachs has also established a $250 million fund that is in use in payment by results in the US. The Deutsche Bank also, along with HSBC, created the first fund that I meant for £10 million on the case of Deutsche Bank and 4 million on the case of HSBC. And this has been, in the case of the experience of the UK, some of the main sponsors. Of course, the other element are, as I was mentioning, some charitable organizations that provide also loans and equity finance. That includes the City of London as an organization, the corporation. Foundations like the Big Lottery Fund is another of the main contributors to the resources that are available on the side of investors. This is gradually changing, is increasing the number of organizations and people who are joining the social finance movement, the social finance opportunity. Could be both, but essentially we are still talking about two streams of types of investors. The channel through organizations like specialist social investment firms, social banks, trusts and foundations. And the other stream will be direct from individuals. And here we are talking about angel investments, we are talking about crowdfunding, we are talking about community shares and social investment tax relief that comes from the individuals. I'm also providing you with a link so you can explore on your own with more details the examples about these different sources of funding coming from the perspective of different types of investors. The third pillar is the social investment finance intermediaries, also known as the SIFIs. Something important to mention here is that one of the important functions they play is that they facilitate in many ways not only the process of matching the investor with the social enterprise that requires the funding, but also they provide or somehow they facilitate the exit from the investment. And this is a very important element with, sometimes it goes overlooked. We sometimes talk about the process of providing the resources to a social enterprise, and we assume that the company will do well and that it will do well in terms of income generation, the profitability, and it will do the expected positive social or sustainable impact. And we assume that because of that, the investor will be happy with the outcome. But most of the time, when we are talking about sustainable impact, it's very difficult that we could be talking about something that will happen in the short term. By its own nature, we are talking about processes that may take several years and that most of the time represent a view of long-term investment. So when you commit as an investor some resources and you find suddenly that in order to exit from that investment you will need to wait for several years, that very likely will put off an important number of potential investors. So one of the solutions comes from the activity of financial intermediaries that could quickly identify an alternative investor that could enter instead of the original one. Particularly in the case of the social stock exchanges, one of the key challenges is that there is need for some form of secondary market. And here I mean that one way of investing in a social enterprise from the equity perspective is to become partners, and the money that is provided to the company is not a loan, so is part of the commitment of the partner to run the risk of the company and to obtain benefits from the gradual success, the economic success of the company. But that may take years, especially we are talking about companies that in some cases are relatively young. We are not talking about startups. We are talking about companies that are eligible to obtain this type of social finance solutions are organizations that are already proved to have an effective income generation system. So we are not talking about startups. But in terms of the challenge for social stock exchanges in the context of the social enterprises is that the market, the potential of the market is relatively small, and that creates a vicious cycle because it discourages some people to join, because even if there is a secondary market, the liquidity in that market, the possibility that someone will quickly replace me as an investor will be a problem. So there is a big challenge there. However, in an effective way, organizations like the Social Stock Exchange in the UK have managed to develop that secondary market. So this is something interesting that is evolving. It is for many one of the greatest barriers to further develop the solution of or the mechanisms of social stock exchanges as an instrument, as a vehicle that complements banking services for social finance. or another of the different modalities that we have mentioned. So that aspect of the exit from the investment is key when we are talking about the financial intermediaries, but in particular in terms of the social finance intermediaries. Another function of the intermediaries, again, is the brokerage ability that they have to join not only enterprises with investors, but also with a broader range of providers of consultancy services of very different kinds, and also to link or to provide some brokerage service to refer them to financial investment advisors, experts on law, tax, accountancy, that have the particular skill and expertise in relation to the aspects of the social impact that is involved in these organizations. So we are not talking about any lawyer or any accountant that is used to the mainstream commercial organization. Of course, the possibility of an effective, focused networking, technical support, and pooling resources, money, and other type of intangible assets is a series of functions that provide financial intermediaries in this context. We talked a moment ago about the charity bank in the UK. The charity bank has also a very interesting story. It has grown well. It remains a small bank. One of the ways in which you could see the activity and very specific examples of what type of organization they are supporting in different sectors is simply in their website. On their website they have very nicely created a resource to look for their supported organizations, and you can see how good they are doing, how well they are doing, and in which areas of the UK they are operating. Unlike the social stock exchange in the UK, that is providing services to companies in different countries, not only in the UK, the charity bank is exclusive, as far as I understand, to services for organizations and individuals in the UK. It's very encouraging also the amount of examples that now are available from the different intermediaries that you can, financial intermediaries committed to social impact, because one of the challenges in the past used to be the very limited number of concrete examples that you could refer, or it was more complicated to compare one with another for different reasons related to indicators or criteria. Gradually, these elements are being evolving in a very positive way, so it makes easier to take a look at different financial intermediaries and see how they are doing, and it's something that I really encourage you to take a look and to explore and compare. In terms of social stock exchanges, there are a good number of organizations in different countries that are operating. One of the most advanced is the Social Stock Exchange in the UK. They have already moved to open locations for services in another parts of the UK. Initially they were only in London. Now they are moving their presence to other strategic areas in the UK, which shows also how this system is working well, is making progress, but very importantly, we are talking about an activity that is, for good reasons, reliant and beneficial to the local economy. That aspect of the local contact between investors, social enterprises, and even the financial intermediaries is a feature that I believe is very interestingly present in how the social stock exchanges are operating, and that creates for some a reason to be discouraged, because some people believe that if it depends to some extent in more direct contact in small communities locally, then the chances of making a big, large business and replicating a large scale will reduce. I believe that the social stock exchange in the UK has proved that that's not the case. And keeping that balance, I believe, is one of the challenges of this type of alternatives or supplementary organizations in the field of financial intermediaries for social development. There is another interesting case of a well-advanced system in Asia. We are talking about the impact investment exchange that is a collaboration between Singapore and Mauritius. They are based in Singapore, but they operate in partnership with the stock exchange of Mauritius. And they have been very successful in what they are doing. I invite you also to take a look at the website. It's very, very interesting how they are operating and how long now they have been in business. So they are creating an important axis in the process of the evolution of social stock exchanges, and in general the field of social finance across countries. There is also another social stock exchange in South Africa. There is one that apparently is going to start in Portugal. There is something similar to the idea of a social stock exchange in Canada, SVX, but is not operating exactly as a social stock exchange. The original, or the first social stock exchange emerged in 2003, the idea, between 2003 and 2006 in Brazil. It was an idea put forward by Celso Graco, a Brazilian guy who was supported in his idea by Ashoka, this organization that supposed change makers. And originally the idea of the social stock exchange, in the way it was put forward by Celso Graco, was within the structure of the stock exchange in Brazil. For different reasons, it has not grown much. The project continues, but it hasn't grown in the way some were expecting, especially being based in one of the largest stock exchanges in Latin America. But there is that element of the beginning, the origins of the social stock exchange. Interestingly, as you can see, in countries that are not necessarily the idea of the developed economy that is at the state of the art of the financial markets, well, and that makes also very interesting the case to see how this is evolving in a different way as mainstream financial intermediaries. So the social stock exchange is very different in the UK as opposed to the one in Spain, and is different to the idea of the exchange in Brazil. That basically, in my view, shows that it can work depending on the particular context, the local circumstances, and it depends a lot on how, as a creative entrepreneur, you find the right solutions for the local circumstances. In many cases, one of the problems, one of the big challenges for this type of financial solutions to grow is that we are talking about organizations, entities that will be facing special heavy regulation because most of the regulation is meant for the mainstream financial intermediaries that not necessarily fit with the approach or the expectations of with what purposes will be operating. So that presents a very interesting challenge that requires to be explored further in order to decide how this type of development can be much better supported by the elements of suitable regulation, suitable taxation, and especially how the natural barriers of costs could in many ways be removed, because if we look at the very specifics, we can realize that some of the reasons that explain why it is so expensive to run a mainstream stock exchange will not necessarily apply to a social stock exchange. Each of these social stock exchanges have their very own system as to how to select or to approve the organizations that will be supported with their functions to facilitate the companies, the social enterprises, to gain access to investment and also other types of supports, technical support that may require for the listing of these social enterprises in the stock exchange. That leads to a function related to the capacity building that is required for many social entrepreneurs, that while they may have a very good idea of how to achieve certain social development goals, they will not necessarily be in the position to be effective in accounting for that particular achievement that they are probably making. That element of the technical expertise and the very different criteria that could be used in by one financial intermediary, whether social stock exchange or a bank type of organization or another type of mechanisms for attracting investment to social enterprises, sustainable enterprises. That goes closely related to how to solve the problem of adequate support, capacity building, that is not necessarily a one-off session of how to run your social enterprise, but it requires a long-term, sometimes hand-in-hand process of monitoring, evaluation, and adjustments of the different ways in which a company, an organization is accounting for their impact. And something important here also is that thanks to that type of interaction between financial intermediaries like-minded with social investors and enterprises, that generates the opportunity to discover and to understand much better on the side of the social entrepreneur who exactly is their stakeholder. Could be tricky, this one. And in the process of accounting for social impact or sustainable impact, it will be surprising if the entrepreneur does not discover that part of the normal work that their organizations are doing is also providing certain unintended positive and negative effects. Some of them could be precisely detected and could be avoided if they are undesirable effects. And in many other cases, it could be this process of discussion and revision of the way in which the social impact is being monitored and assessed and reported that could lead to very unique opportunities to understand how to increase how to maximize the social impact that is being delivered, and in many other ways also how to avoid negative effects of the impact. And that also increase the awareness of social entrepreneurs as to what other stakeholders they are affecting, and for the same reason, what other means of achieving social sustainable impacts could be happening even without making additional or substantial investment in the way the company is working. It's just a matter of keeping an eye, and this is something that requires an evolution in the process of how the actual dynamics of the financial intermediation is helping to achieve these other sometimes indirect benefits to the social enterprise and the stakeholders. Relatively recently, the United Nations area that is looking at the social finance aspects have made important progress from the initial report that they produced that was the financial system we need. This month, on April 2018, they have produced a follow-up report about how to align the financial system in order to be the financial system we need. And so that's one of the most recent progress that has been reported by United Nations. And that goes very directly to the discussions about what, from the view of the experts that have been discussing doing the follow-up, what actions could be made by the different actors that are involved. Not only is a matter of the financial intermediaries, but it requires a much more broader engagement of the relevant actors and other organizations that are supporting the process of financial intermediation and linking the benefits derived from social impact, sustainable impact reports to what is actually taking place that are of the interest of people who are not necessarily the social investors of a particular organization. So the room to increase the level of involvement is growing as well, and I believe that's a very positive outcome of the work that has been done during the past 3 years along the lines of how the financial system could contribute in a much more effective way to the Sustainable Development Goals. In general, the figures, you can see here some that I'm showing you. The figures about how good the sector of social investment is doing are, I believe, promising. They are positive. They are showing an important growth. The number of people, organizations that are coming together is increasing, and clearly there are more and more examples that shows that this is profitable, and that profit is not something that is undesirable if it is happening within the criteria that we could refer as sustainable development process of doing business. So I believe during the following 5 years, the level of information that we can present in a longitudinal approach will have an important effect, a positive effect in encouraging much more investors of the type that will pay attention on the evidence that is supporting the idea that this is a good way of using our resources and pulling together partnerships towards achieving or moving on the direction of the Sustainable Development Goals. However, there are many other reasons as to why an investor may or may not join a particular type of investment, and the element of the psychological aspects, for example, may not necessarily have a direct connection with what this individual social finance organization or the individual entrepreneur can handle. So the challenge here has to do also with how more and more people, academics and different organizations, that think tanks and also governmental entities can make much more out of the data that is becoming available, and also in which ways the analysis of that data is showing us that there are good elements for decision-making processes that so far are not being included or integrated in the usual discussions from decision makers in different levels of organizations of different kind, governmental, third sector organizations, commercial organizations, etc. So this is something I believe that is an exciting stage in the way the evolution of the financial sector working toward the social sustainable development goals is generating, and I believe that the success of the new suggestions put forward by United Nations about how to move in this transition from the mainstream idea of doing business to a more sustainable based criteria of our economy will continue making a win-win situation in most cases.